On a hot July day, the front yard of Mark and Emily Sullivan's new home was buzzing with excitement as they celebrated their housewarming, a new chapter in their lives unfolding before their eyes. The sun's rays slid across the neatly manicured lawn, still smelling of freshly cut grass, and played with the shiny foil of the paper plates. Folding chairs lined the lawn, and in the center was a long table laden with treats. Crisp crackers, bowls of sliced vegetables, sandwiches, a plate of sweetly fragrant strawberries. The air was filled with the sense of warming pine needles from the tall spruce trees behind the house, smoke from a grill, and fresh baked goods that someone had brought in from the house next door. The neighbors, many of whom were seeing the young owners for the first time, came up with smiles, shook hands, and exchanged good wishes. People's faces were slightly pink from the heat, but the atmosphere was warm and almost family-like. From time to time, cheerful laughter was heard, and somewhere nearby someone was quietly humming along to a guitar. Mark, in a faded college t-shirt and baggy shorts, was intently flipping burgers on a brand-new black grill, making sure they were crisp just right. His hands moved confidently, and he had a satisfied smile on his face. Emily, in a light summer dress with a floral print, stood next to a couple of roommates, laughing as she told a funny story about how they got stuck in an elevator with a couch and half a box of boxes on the first day of moving. She spoke animatedly, gesturing, and the sun in her hair made it golden, as if she were the very essence of summer joy. On the porch, in the shade of the awning, 1-year-old Oliver was crawling on all fours. His chubby little hands slapped the warm wooden steps, and his eyes were shining with delight at the new world. His grandmother, who had come to help with the move, was sitting on the top step, swaying slightly to the rhythm of some song of hers and watching her grandson with affection. Oliver occasionally stopped to raise his head and look at her, and then set off again on his little journey of exploration, as if this whole house were a big new planet that he was about to discover. Everything around seemed to be filled with the anticipation of a new life in this yard, in this house, among these people. "Look, he's already exploring the property," Mark said proudly, approaching the porch with a plate of freshly cooked burgers, from which came a thick, appetizing smell of fried meat mixed with the aroma of melted cheese. "Our discoverer," Emily smiled, bending slightly to catch her son before he, swaying playfully on his chubby knees, risked sliding down the steps. Oliver giggled happily, as if the idea of an adventure were the best thing in the world, and immediately reached out to his father with his little hands. His fingers were warm and soft and smelled of something sweet, probably a piece of biscuit that his grandmother had slipped him earlier without anyone noticing. Mark, having placed the plate on the wooden railing, took his son in his arms, pressing him to his chest. The boy settled comfortably in his arms, resting his forehead on his shoulder, but at the same time did not stop babbling something in his funny baby language, fiddling with the collar of his father's shirt. "So, Olia, how do you like the new house?" Mark asked softly, almost in a whisper, rocking his son slightly. He answered something vaguely, perhaps his childish version of the word yes, and again reached for his father's face, as if he wanted to get a better look at his smile. "He seems to approve," Emily said tenderly, standing next to him with her arm around his waist, her dress fluttering slightly in the light summer breeze. Mark turned his head and gently kissed her temple. "Thank you. Without you, none of this would have happened." "And without you too," she objected, looking at him with eyes that reflected the sun, the noise of the yard, and all the warm feelings that connected them. Mark touched her cheek with his free hand, lingering a little longer than the moment called for. In her eyes, he saw more than just himself. He saw their shared history, their dreams, their belief that it was only just beginning. "Hey, hosts," a cheerful cry came from the table. "Will there be food?" "We're already bringing it," Emily responded, and there was that lightness in her voice that only appears in moments of pure happiness. She quickly kissed her husband on the lips, deftly intercepted the plate of burgers, and hurried to her hungry friends, laughing and joking about something with them. Mark remained on the porch with his son in his arms. He slowly looked around the yard. Someone was pouring lemonade into clear plastic cups at a table. Several neighbors were chatting animatedly, comparing stories about renovations and moving. Light music was coming from a small portable speaker, creating a background atmosphere of a summer holiday. Children, whose names he didn't even know, were running barefoot on the grass, chasing each other and squealing with delight. It all looked like a scene from his best dreams. His own cozy house with white trim, a green lawn, the smell of fresh wood from the porch that hadn't yet weathered, and most importantly, his loved ones nearby. He hugged Oliver a little tighter. "Remember this day, son," he said quietly, almost confidentially, as if sharing a secret. "This is the beginning of our new happy life." The boy's little heart was beating somewhere next to his own, and this beating seemed to be the truest and warmest sound in the world. Oliver responded with a cheerful squeak that sounded like a bird's chirp, and Mark couldn't help but laugh, feeling joy spreading inside him, as if sunlight had hit his soul. He walked down the steps and back to the guests, smelling the light scent of summer mixed with the smoke from the grill and the sweet aroma of strawberries from the table. It never occurred to him that this perfect day was just a quiet preface. Ahead of them lay not only happiness, but also trials that would test the strength of everything they now considered unshakable. Mark Sullivan turned the key in the lock and stepped through the threshold of his home in a quiet Chicago suburb. The evening air was warm and still, and crickets chirped outside. Outside, the soft summer twilight was gathering, painting the manicured lawns of the neighboring houses and the golden-orange hues of the setting sun. The street was familiarly suburban quiet, save for the occasional car or the bark of a dog. He smiled to himself. This evening was the embodiment of everything he had dreamed of 10 years ago, when he and his wife moved here away from the hustle and bustle of the city. A quiet area, friendly neighbors, family comfort, the home of their dreams. "Daddy's here." 7-year-old Oliver's joyful cry came from the living room as soon as Mark closed the door behind him. Mark barely had time to put his briefcase down by the coat rack when his son rushed towards him, wrapping his arms around his waist. He scooped the boy up in his arms, feeling the weight of the day gradually lift. "Hey, baby, how was your day?" Mark kissed his son on the top of his head and put him down on the floor. "We were drawing in class, and then my mom let me play on the console for a bit," Oliver blurted out, beaming. "Really? Great." Mark ruffled his son's hair. "Did you do your homework?" The boy rolled his eyes, but nodded. "Yes, Dad, I did everything." The sound of pots banging in the kitchen was Emily stirring something on the stove. Mark, holding his son's hand, walked further into the house. The pleasant aroma of tomato sauce and basil wafted from the kitchen. His wife was making pasta, one of the family's favorite dishes. "Hello, dear," Emily said, peering around the kitchen door frame. Her cheeks were flushed from the heat of the stove, and a few strands of brown hair had escaped their recent styling. She always primped herself a little for his arrival, something Mark found touching. She was wearing a light blue sundress that hugged her waist, and for a moment Mark admired her girlishly slender figure. "Hi," he leaned toward his wife and kissed her cheek. Emily's skin was warm and smelled of vanilla and lavender, the familiar scent of her favorite body lotion. But whether he was imagining it or not, Mark's deft nose caught the faintest hint of a new perfume he hadn't noticed on her before. Emily returned to the stove to stir the sauce, and Mark's eyebrows lingered on the back of her head. New perfume? Maybe just a different soap or shampoo. He shook off the suspicious thought, why would he even care? During dinner, Mark occasionally glanced across the table at his wife. Oliver was chatting cheerfully about cartoons while he ladled cooling pasta onto a plate, but Mark was barely listening. It was obvious to him that Emily was a bit absent-minded today. She smiled at her son, nodded at his remarks, but as soon as the conversation died down, her gaze immediately darted past Mark, as if she was thinking about something. "How was the showing of the house this morning?" he asked, remembering that she had mentioned meeting a new client. Emily sold real estate and often arranged showings of houses for potential buyers. She blinked, emerging from her thoughts. "Oh yeah, the show. Overall, it's fine. The client is looking, thinking." Mark noticed that she didn't add any details, something she usually shared, especially when a family was looking to buy their dream home. but he didn't ask. Emily's phone, lying on the table next to her, blinked. She quickly turned it face down without even looking. Mark put down his fork. His internal jealousy radar, which had never given cause before, suddenly gave an alarm. His wife didn't even look to see who was texting her. She had never hidden her phone in front of him before. He felt an unpleasant tickling sensation growing in his chest. He tried to push it away. Nonsense. Just a coincidence. "Dad, can I not have it anymore? I'm full." Oliver's voice brought him back to reality. "Okay, young man, what about dessert?" Emily tried to say cheerfully, but Mark noticed that her smile was strained. "Do we have dessert?" The son perked up. "The freezer says there's vanilla ice cream," Emily replied, standing up. "Who wants chocolate syrup?" Oliver raised his hand happily. "Bring it to both of you." Mark tried to smile too. He forced himself to look away from his wife's phone and his suspicions, switching to his son's happy face. However, as soon as dinner was over and the plates were cleared, Emily glanced at her watch and suddenly said, "Mark, honey, I need to go away for an hour. The client just decided to look at one house option today, and he has a flight tomorrow morning, no other time." This evening, Mark was wary, frowning. "It's almost 8. Odd time for a show." Emily shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "I know, but what can you do? He is very interested. I don't want to miss the chance to sell." She hurried into the hallway, already taking her light denim jacket out of the closet. Mark followed, feeling anxiety scratching at his insides again. "Maybe I should come with you," he suggested. "It's getting dark already. It's inconvenient to drive around the empty streets by myself." "No, no, it's not worth it," Emily responded quickly, pulling her jacket over her sundress. "You better put Oliver to bed, okay? I'll be quick." She was clearly avoiding his gaze, busily checking to make sure she had her keys and phone. Mark noticed that his wife's hands were shaking slightly. "Are you sure everything is okay?" he asked quietly, carefully wording the question. Perhaps this client could wait until tomorrow. Emily looked him straight in the eye for the first time that evening, tension flickering in her gaze. "Mark, please." "I have to go," she said, a little irritated. "Don't make a mountain out of a molehill, okay?" He raised his palms in surrender. "Okay, sorry. I'm just worried about you." Her expression softened immediately. Emily stepped towards him and kissed him briefly on the lips. "Everything is fine. I'll be back soon. I love you." "I love you too," Mark answered automatically, but his wife's kiss did not dispel his anxiety. Quite the contrary, her hasty, tender gesture seemed like an attempt to distract him. He stood on the porch and watched Emily get into the car and drive out of the yard, disappearing into the twilight of the maple-lined alley. His heart pounded loudly. Mark tried to convince himself that the reason for his anxiety was just ordinary concern, but the strange feeling inside grew stronger. He knew her too well, every little thing, her smiles, intonations, gestures, and now everything in his wife's behavior signaled that something was wrong. Left alone, he stood for a long time in the empty living room, listening to the silence of the house. Somewhere upstairs, a floorboard creaked. Oliver went to bed, as his dad asked. The clock said it was about 9 in the evening. Mark went to the window and pulled back the curtain. The streetlights were shining dimly behind the glass, and moths were circling in their circle. There was not a soul on the street. The house seemed especially quiet and empty without his wife. He suddenly felt lonely, as he had not felt for a long time. Deep inside the house, the wall clock ticked. The minutes dragged by surprisingly slowly. Mark automatically checked his phone. There were no messages from Emily. She must still be busy with a client. He sighed, trying to push the illusion away. Surely everything really was fine. But then why was there such a clawing anxiety inside? Lines from a recent newspaper article about family infidelity that he had read on the way to the subway floated into his head. He had skimmed through them then, not wanting to fill his head with negativity. Statistics, reasons. Now, every line came back to him like an evil prophecy. Could this really affect him? Their family? Enough, he ordered himself mentally. You're paranoid. Mark tried to distract himself. He turned on the TV, tried to read the news on his tablet. But every few minutes he caught himself looking at the time and listening for the door to slam. It was nearly 10:30 when the car finally started rumbling outside the house. Mark, who had been pacing nervously around the living room by then, stopped dead in his tracks. He heard the front door open as Emily crept inside. "Emily?" he called quietly, stepping out into the hallway. The wife shuddered, obviously not expecting him to be awake. For a moment, fear flashed in her eyes, which was immediately replaced by a tired smile. "Hi, I tried to be quiet. I thought you were resting," she whispered. "No, I was waiting for you." Mark forced himself to speak calmly. "How did it go?" "You took a long time." She turned away, hanging up her jacket. "Longer than I expected." "The client was talkative," she replied casually, "but he seems interested. Sorry to worry you." Mark stared at her back. It seemed that something had changed in his wife's appearance in the last few hours. Her hair was a little disheveled. There was a slight blush on her neck. He didn't remember if she had the same lipstick on. Emily's lips seemed a little paler now, as if it had been rubbed off. "Everything's fine," he said after a pause. "The main thing is that you're home." Emily turned and smiled softly at him. "Of course, at home. Where else?" She stepped forward and hugged him, pressing her cheek against his chest. Mark slowly wrapped his arm around her shoulders, feeling her tremble, just barely. Whether from fatigue or... "I love you," he said quietly, kissing the top of her head. There were so many questions on the tip of his tongue, but he remained silent. "I love you too," she whispered back. That night, Mark couldn't fall asleep for a long time. Emily seemed to fall asleep almost immediately, barely touching the pillow. He could hear her even breathing next to him. The bedroom was dark and quiet. Mark stared at the ceiling, and fragments of the picture appeared before his eyes again and again. Her detached gaze at dinner, the phone screen flickering on the table, the tension in her voice when she left, and the noticeable smell of someone else's perfume that he caught when she returned. The scent haunted him, giving him no peace. Mark was sure that Emily was wearing more than just her usual perfume. A sweetish, spicy note of someone else's cologne, barely noticeable, but he caught it. Someone else's scent stuck to her hair or clothes. The thought made his chest feel cold. He rolled over, trying to calm himself. "You never know," he thought. "Maybe the client put on too much perfume, and that's why it's on her." Of course, that's probably true. But, closing his eyes, Mark felt that the doubts had not gone away, but were only lurking in the darkness of the bedroom, like a ghost, ready to grow and torment him further. In the morning, Mark woke up exhausted after a sleepless night. Emily was sleeping peacefully on the pillow next to him. He quietly got out of bed so as not to wake her and crept into the bathroom. In the shower, the warm water helped wash away the tension of the previous evening, but his thoughts returned again and again to the same questions. When he went down to the kitchen, he found that Emily had already made coffee and breakfast for all of her pancakes with cream. His wife was busy at the stove, looking cheerful, as if nothing had happened. She kissed her husband on the cheek, holding out a mug. "Good morning. How did you sleep?" "Fine," Mark lied and took a sip of coffee. In fact, his head felt heavy. "You're early today," Emily noted, glancing at her watch. Her voice was soft as usual. "I wanted to leave a little earlier. I'm swamped at work," he responded, sitting down at the table. Oliver ran into the dining room with a backpack over his shoulder. "Hi, Dad." Mark hugged his son. "Ready for school?" "Yeah." "Mom, can I not finish this?" "I really don't want any more," the boy asked, glancing sideways at the remains of the pancakes. "Okay then," Emily sighed. "Go brush your teeth." When his son ran away, Mark looked at his wife. He was still haunted by her absence at night, but now, in the daylight, it was hard to believe that these worries were real. Here she was dear, smiling, caring. "Maybe I really am winding myself up," he thought, watching Emily wash the dishes in the sink. He wanted to come up to her right now, hug her from behind, bury his face in her soft hair, and forget all his doubts. He had already gotten up from the table when suddenly a message came on Emily's phone lying next to him. Mark involuntarily glanced at it. The name Sarah Job appeared on the screen. Emily immediately wiped her hands and picked up the phone. "Sorry," she said to her husband. "I have to answer. It's a colleague from the agency about a new object." "Of course," Mark muttered. He looked away, feeling an unpleasant feeling in his stomach. Emily typed a quick reply, trying to keep the screen out of his sight. Then she put the phone in her pocket. "Well, I have to run too. There are shows in the morning today," she said and approached him. Mark stood up. She hugged him goodbye tightly, as if nothing had happened. "Have a nice day, darling," she whispered. "And you too," he replied, kissing her forehead. While Mark was helping his son put on his sneakers and packing his school bag, he saw out of the corner of his eye how Emily hurried out, apparently to make it to the first meeting. A few minutes later, the engine of her car roared outside the house. "Dad, are we late?" Oliver asked. Mark looked at his watch. He had been thinking longer than he thought. "Damn it," he swore quietly. "Get in the car now." He and his son ran out of the house. Mark drove Oliver to school, trying to push away his troubling thoughts and focus on the workday ahead. But on the way to the office, stuck in the morning traffic jam on the way out of the suburbs, he couldn't get the morning message Emily had received out of his head. Sarah, work, was the sender's name. Mark tried unsuccessfully to remember if his wife had mentioned any Sarah to her colleagues. It seemed she hadn't. At the real estate agency where Emily worked, he knew only two employees from her stories, Michelle and Kate. Who was Sarah, a newbie or a pseudonym? His thoughts were darting around like annoying flies. He tried to be rational. Maybe there really was a new employee and he just didn't know about it. After all, he couldn't pester her about every message. But the scene at breakfast, how Emily hastily closed the screen, wouldn't leave my mind. The traffic jam eased up a bit as he approached Chicago, and Mark finally reached a parking spot near his office. He usually arrived earlier and parked closer, but today he had to find a spot further away. Stepping out onto the sidewalk, he inhaled the noisy air of the metropolis, a mixed smell of asphalt, morning coffee from a nearby cafe, and exhaust fumes. There were a few minutes left before the start of the workday. Mark took out his phone. There were no new messages from Emily. He suddenly felt a strong desire to call her just like that, to wish her a good day, as they sometimes did, and at the same time to hear what she was doing. He pressed call, holding the phone to his ear. The beeps echoed in his chest in long thumps. "Come on, take it," Mark muttered under his breath, feeling his excitement growing. But the answering machine answered. "Hi, this is Emily. I can't talk right now. Leave a message." Mark hung up without even agreeing. Maybe she was busy with a client and had set the phone to silent. He tried not to think about it. At the office, at the computer, business distracted him at least a little from his dark suspicions. Mark was a financial analyst at a large company. The job required attention to detail. But today, the numbers stubbornly did not add up to the usual tables. Several times he caught himself staring at the monitor, trying to remember where he had left off. Completely different images came to mind. Emily driving away into the night. Someone else's cologne on her clothes. An unknown colleague, Sarah, who sent a message at the crack of dawn. Around midday, Mark couldn't take it anymore. He typed into a search engine, "signs of a wife's infidelity." He knew it was stupid and paranoid, but his finger clicked on the first link. The screen read, 10 sure signs of infidelity. Mark quickly scanned the list. Drastic changes in appearance or behavior. Confidentiality, telephone, passwords. Frequent delays at work or sudden absences. Detachment in communication, coldness. Feelings of guilt expressed through excessive care or gifts. He couldn't read any further. Enough coincidences were already popping up before his eyes. Emily had really dressed up lately. She was paying more attention to her makeup and bought a couple of new dresses for work. Her phone seemed to have become forbidden territory once they could even answer each other's phone if someone was busy, but that hadn't happened for a long time. Well, and yesterday's sudden absence. His blood ran cold as he mentally checked off each item. Mark leaned his elbows on the table and covered his face with his hands. "Hey, buddy, everything okay?" A colleague's voice rang out nearby. Mark winced and turned around. It was Tom, a colleague from the neighboring department. "Yes, everything is fine," he quickly answered, straightening up. "I just have a headache." "You're probably overtired. Take a day off," Tom chuckled good-naturedly. "No, everything's fine," Mark waved it off. "Thank you, Tom." The colleague shrugged and left, and Mark turned off the browser. This is madness, he thought. I don't recognize myself. Just one strange evening, and I'm already searching the internet for confirmation. Mark ran his hand over his face. He didn't recognize himself. Just yesterday, he had considered his marriage strong and happy, and today he allowed himself the darkest suspicions. He had always trusted his wife could something change so abruptly, but each new coincidence undermined his confidence. What if their family was not as ideal as he thought? What if he didn't know the woman closest to him well? He firmly decided to throw everything out of his head until the evening and get down to business. He almost succeeded. A series of meetings and calls distracted him. Time flew by. But as soon as he went down to the garage and got behind the wheel, the anxiety came back with renewed vigor. On the way to pick up his son, Mark decided to stop at the local supermarket to buy steaks and wine and have a nice dinner at home. He wanted to spend the evening with his family to feel normal, and maybe, little by little, to dispel his stupid fears. Oliver sat in the back seat, pleased. "Dad, Mom is still not here. She promised to pick me up, but she didn't come." Mark became wary. "What? She didn't come?" "Uh-huh. The teacher said that my mother wrote that she couldn't, and that I should be given to you. You haven't forgotten, have you?" He had indeed received a text from Emily that afternoon. "I can't pick up Oliver after school. I have a meeting." Mark had only nodded to himself, then he thought it was a work meeting. But now, as they were driving home, he wondered, what kind of meeting could she have had that evening? Probably with the client again. Or, "Mark," a voice suddenly sounded, pulling him out of his reverie. The car pulled up in the driveway of their house. Brian, Mark's neighbor and close friend, leaned toward the window, smiling. "Oh, hi," Mark rolled down the window. "Didn't expect to see you." "Well, I was passing by and decided to drop in." Brian nodded at the bag of groceries on the passenger's seat. "Are you cooking something? Maybe I should help?" Mark hesitated. Normally, he would have welcomed the company. He and Brian often had barbecues together or watched football. But for some reason, he didn't want to see anyone right now. Emily should be here soon. We were going to have dinner as a family," he said politely. "I understand, no problem." The friend stepped back, raising his hands. Then another time. Oliver jumped out of the car and rushed to hug Uncle Brian as the boy had taken to calling him. Brian laughed, picking the boy up in his arms. Mark noticed briefly that his friend looked tired. There were shadows under his eyes. Probably he worked late at work. Brian was a freelance programmer and often worked nights. "Okay, I won't disturb you," Brian repeated, lowering Oliver to the ground. "Have a nice evening, buddy. We'll call tomorrow." He waved his hand and headed towards his house across the road. Mark got out of the car with a bag of groceries and followed his son to the door. He felt a little guilty. His friend clearly wanted to talk, and Oliver would be glad too. But today Mark wanted something else: to be alone with his wife and finally clarify the vague thing that separated them. Once inside, he immediately dialed Emily's number. It was just after 5, and she was usually back by now. The phone was not picked up again. Mark left a voice message. We're home now. I got the groceries. I want to cook dinner. Will you be back soon?" She and her son busied themselves with chores, Mark marinating steaks, Oliver doing homework at the kitchen table. An hour passed, then another. Emily didn't call back. By 7 o'clock, Mark was really getting nervous. He pulled out his phone and called again. This time she answered. "Hi, sorry, I have a client. Everything is delayed." There were some vague noises in the background of the phone, as if she was on the road. "Will you be there soon?" he asked, trying to keep his voice even. "In an hour, probably," Emily answered after a pause. "Don't wait for me with dinner. I ate on the go." "Have you eaten?" Mark asked, stunned, but the answer was a short beep. She had already switched off. Mark lowered the phone. His heart was pounding. Eating on the go. She had never done that before. She always tried to eat dinner at home with her family. He found himself gripping the edge of the kitchen table tightly, his knuckles turning white. "Dad," a voice came quietly nearby. Mark winced and turned around. Oliver was standing there, his eyes wide. He must have never seen his father so tense. "It's all right, son," Mark squeezed out, softening his voice. "Mommy will be home soon. Go play for now, okay?" Oliver nodded slowly and walked out. Mark turned back to the tabletop, closing his eyes. He felt that he was losing ground. Suspicions that had been ghostly yesterday were becoming more and more real today. It was already after 8 when he finally heard the sound of a car pulling up to the house. Mark perked up, on the edge between anger and fear of finding out the truth. The door opened and Emily walked in. She was dressed in business attire, a dark blue dress and jacket, and looked tired. "Hello," she called quietly, putting her bag by the door. Mark walked out of the kitchen. Behind him, steaks were cooling on the stove, still half-cooked. "Hello," he replied. "It took you a long time." Emily fidgeted with the handle of her bag, avoiding his gaze. "I'm so sorry. It all happened suddenly. I didn't have time to warn you. The client turned out to be very picky. I had to show several options, go to different addresses. And eat on the way," Mark added coldly, unable to resist. The wife bit her lip. "Mark, please don't start. I'm tired." He peered into her face, trying to understand what was hidden behind that mask of fatigue. Was there guilt or just irritation? "I'm not starting," he answered quietly. "I was just worried. You've disappeared for the second evening in a row." "It's work," she shrugged, finally looking him in the eye. "You know, it's happened before." Mark didn't answer. Oh yes, it had happened before, but she had always warned in advance, always explained. But now everything was different. In the silence that followed, the sound of the TV came from the living room, the cartoon Oliver was watching. Emily was the first to look away and bent down, unlacing her low-heeled shoes. "Let's not do this now. I'm really exhausted." Mark clenched his jaws so hard that his teeth even creaked, but he remained silent. He understood that just a little more, and he would explode, start a direct conversation that neither he nor she was ready for. And with a child nearby, that was impossible. "Okay," he said quietly, "go and rest." Emily nodded gratefully and walked past into the bedroom, grabbing her bag. Mark watched her go. He wanted so badly to get the truth out of her, right now, whatever it was. But the sight of her tired face and their son in the next room held him back. He returned to the kitchen, turned off the stove, and put away the unused food without appetite. Then he mechanically tidied up the living room and checked his son's homework. He did everything trying to calm his frantic heartbeat and the blood pulsating in his temples. Finally, having put Oliver to bed, Mark went into the bedroom. Emily was already lying down, turned to the wall. Judging by her measured breathing, she was asleep. He lay down quietly next to her, trying not to disturb her. But in the darkness, his eyes opened again, and his brain began feverishly analyzing the smallest details of the past day. He remembered how, just a week ago, as he was going to bed, he had tried to hug her and kiss her, but Emily had pulled away, muttering that she was very tired. At the time, he hadn't paid attention to it. Who knows, it really had been a hard day. But now that episode 2 took on an ominous meaning. And there were quite a few of them. And each one was like a stroke in a terrifying picture that he was afraid to see in its entirety. Emily lay in the darkness of the bedroom, listening to Mark's breathing. It was shallow and uneven, suggesting he was awake too. Her chest tightened with guilt and worry. For the second night in a row, she came home late, having lied to her husband. Mark didn't know for sure, but he seemed to suspect. She saw it in his eyes, heard it in the tone of his voice. Usually gentle, his voice now rang with tension, coldness. He didn't ask direct questions, but this silence was more terrible than reproach. Emily turned her head cautiously. In the dim light of the street lamp, her husband's profile was visible through a crack in the curtain sharp, frowning. He was looking at the ceiling. Her heart skipped a beat. She knew that he would keep it under wraps until the last minute and would harbor suspicions within himself until he burst. And then, she closed her eyes, swallowing the lump in her throat. What had she done? The phone under the pillow beeped quietly. A message had arrived. Emily carefully slipped out of bed, trying not to disturb her husband, and went out into the hallway. She took out her phone. A message from Brian. "I can't sleep. I'm thinking about you. How are you?" The text read. Her fingers trembled on the screen. What to say? That she, too, was exhausted with worry. That their secret world was crumbling before her eyes? She tiptoed into the bathroom and closed the door. She quietly dialed. "Everything is fine. Sleep." Sent. A minute later, the phone blinked again. "Love you." Emily ran her hand over her face, holding back her sobs. She suddenly wanted to answer Mark in kind, to tell him that she loved him. But now those would be empty words. She had proven the opposite with her actions. She returned to the bedroom. Mark lay motionless, perhaps asleep or still pretending. Emily lay down carefully, facing the wall. Tears slowly ran down her cheeks, wetting the pillowcase. How did she end up like this? Just 6 months ago, life seemed so normal. Yes, there were household problems. Yes, Mark worked a lot and was tired. But is that a reason to destroy the family? She wasn't looking for an affair, it found her. As trite as it may sound, Brian was there when she needed attention and warmth. He was a friend with whom she could share her complaints about life, and when he crossed the line, he became someone more. She didn't even realize how she had developed feelings for him. Forbidden, sinful, but so attractive. And now there was a price to pay for it. Emily looked at her husband's back in the dim light. He turned slightly, and she quickly closed her eyes, pretending to be asleep. For a few minutes, Mark's breathing could be heard very close. He must have been looking at her, checking whether she was asleep or not. Emily barely restrained herself from shuddering under the blanket. Finally, she felt him turn back. She wanted to burst into tears. It would be better if he screamed, said everything, than like this. "I have to tell him everything myself." The thought flashed. But the very idea of admitting to cheating made her terrified. She imagined how she would say, "Mark, I cheated on you," and shuddered internally. Her husband's face appeared before her eyes, at first uncomprehending, then mutilated with pain and disgust. He would probably pack his things and leave, or kick her out himself. What would happen to Oliver? He would never understand why Mom and Dad were no longer together. No, she did not have the determination to take such a step. Even though she had betrayed him, she loved her husband. She just loved both of them at once. She remembered their past, all the happy years that Mark had given her. He had never hurt her, tolerated her whims, supported her in everything. He had been a wonderful husband and father, and now she had hurt him so much. When Oliver was born and Emily could not sleep at night, exhausted by the baby's colic, Mark took on all the chores. She also remembered the time when she had a bad cold. He asked for time off from work, sat by her bed for days, gave her hot tea, and patiently brought down the fever with cold compresses. He was always there in difficult times. She didn't know how to be torn between guilt and unfinished passion. Does this happen? She thought. Probably not. Being torn between two people was unbearably painful. Emily barely slept a wink all night. She was torn between thoughts. Should she confess everything now, beg for forgiveness, or break up with Brian? Some voice inside her told her that this couldn't go on any longer. At dawn, just as the gray light was beginning to dawn, she heard Mark's alarm clock. He turned it off almost immediately, not letting the ringing disperse. Normally, she would have turned around and kissed him sweetly on the shoulder. But now she was lying there, pretending to be asleep. She just didn't know how to look him in the eyes. Mark stood up quietly and walked out, probably to the bathroom. And after a while, Emily heard his footsteps going down the stairs. He didn't wake her, as he sometimes did when she was dozing off in fits and starts. He just left. She finally exhaled and opened her eyes. Her heart was pounding. Something had to be decided today. Almost immediately, the phone beeped again. "Brian. Morning. How are you?" Emily scribbled a reply, not knowing what she wanted to write, that she was scared, that she was on the verge of telling her husband everything. In the end, she wrote only, "Hi, I don't know. Mark suspects something." The answer came instantly. "Let's meet. Today. We need to talk." She bit her lip. It was dangerous, but perhaps it was necessary. They couldn't tear themselves apart any longer, hide and wait for exposure. Maybe she and Brian should stop for now, or end this story altogether. "Okay? Where?" she dialed. "In a minute. Lakeview Inn, 11 m. Remember, it's quiet there." Emily closed her eyes. Lakeview Inn, an old motel by the lake where she and Mark had once stayed when they were college sweethearts. Brian knew about that trip. Mark had told her about it, and now this place would become the setting for her betrayal. Symbolic. "Cold," she answered shortly. Everything was a blur after that. While getting Oliver ready for school, she mechanically made breakfast, trying to speak as usual. The boy chattered cheerfully about school, and Emily could hardly keep a smile on her face. Mark came down pale, said he had a headache, and announced that he would stay home. Emily was worried would her meeting fall through. Had he decided to follow her? But judging by her husband's appearance, it seemed that he really was unwell. Pale, dark circles under his eyes. "Maybe I should stay too," she asked, trying to sound naturally caring. "No, no," Mark quickly waved it off. "I'm fine. Go." This encouraged her and at the same time upset her. He did not want her company. She kissed him on the forehead goodbye and left, taking her son. After dropping Oliver off at school, Emily headed to her first appointment, a home showing for a client. She'd been on autopilot all morning. She could see Mark and Oliver's faces in her head. She could lose them if she didn't stop. She had to make a decision. At 10:45, she was relieved of a client who had questions and responded to Brian's message. "I'm on my way." On the way to the motel, her heart pounding, Emily kept repeating to herself, "I will tell him everything, that this cannot go on, that I choose family." Her hands were shaking as she pulled into the deserted parking lot of the Lakeview Inn. Brian was already there, his car arriving a minute later. Seeing him come out to greet her, Emily felt the familiar thrill, but for the first time, it was mingled with a sharp sense of longing. She approached him. "Hello," was all she could say. Brian ran his hand over her shoulder. "Hello, honey. How are you?" Emily took a deep breath, preparing to start a difficult conversation, but Brian suddenly gently touched her face and, without giving her time to come to her senses, kissed her tenderly, carefully. For a moment she forgot about everything, responding to the kiss. It was so familiar and warm in his arms. But then she came to her senses and pulled away. "Brian, we need to have a serious talk." He nodded, taking her hand. "Of course. Let's go to the room. It's quiet there." Emily stepped with him under the motel canopy, not even suspecting that eyes burning with pain and anger were watching them from afar. The next morning, Mark woke up with a clear decision. He had to find out the truth at any cost. Ignorance ate away at him worse than an open wound. As soon as dawn broke, he was already on his feet, having thought out a plan. He decided to take a day off from work under the pretext of feeling unwell. This gave him freedom of action. He would be able to follow his wife or show up where she was not expected. Emily seemed unsuspecting. At breakfast, Mark complained of a migraine and looked tired not far from the truth, and said he might stay home that day. His wife frowned sympathetically, advised him to take a pill and rest. "Maybe I should stay too," she suggested. "I can reschedule the meetings. I'll take care of you." "No, no," Mark quickly refused, trying to look convincing. I'm fine. I just need a little peace and quiet. Go ahead, don't worry. Emily looked at him for a moment longer, then nodded. As you wish. Call if you need anything. She kissed him on the forehead, like a child, before leaving. Mark felt a pang of guilt he had to lie to her in return, to play the role of the sick man. But this lie seemed insignificant compared to the one he suspected his wife of. After waiting for Emily to leave and take her son to school, Mark got down to business. First, he searched the house for anything unusual. He looked in the nightstand by her dressing table. There was only perfume, brushes, old postcards. He checked the bottom drawers of the dresser piles of linens, nothing extra. Feeling like a burglar, Mark tiptoed into their bedroom and opened the closet, sorting through the pockets of her clothes. Empty. On the shelf in the office, he found a box where Emily kept various small items and old photographs, but nothing suspicious. It was dirty and unpleasant rummaging through the things of a loved one, but he told himself that it was necessary. There was nothing special to be found. No secret second phone, no suspicious receipts. Even in her purse, which he mentally apologized and opened, there was only the usual: wallet, cosmetic bag, pen, notebook with addresses of houses for sale. Mark flipped through his notebook. Client appointments, addresses. Today's date was marked 11 a.m. show, 18 Willow Street, then 3 p.m. meeting office. His heart was pounding. There it was, the day's schedule, at least the official one. He pulled out his phone and typed in the address on Willow Street. It turned out to be in the next neighborhood, about 20 minutes away. It was unlikely that he could simply show up at the show. As an outsider, he would scare off the client. But the idea of following from afar seemed reasonable. Mark quickly got ready, threw the hood of his light jacket up in case he had to hide, and drove out of the garage. By 10:30, he had already parked some distance from 18 Willow Street, a nice but long vacant cottage with a "for sale" sign. A couple of minutes later, Emily's car pulled up. Mark instantly curled up in his seat, watching from afar. His wife got out of the car with a folder in her hands. She was wearing a formal dark green suit and low-heeled shoes, elegant and formal. Her hair was done, her makeup was discreet. She looked beautiful and unfamiliarly formal. Mark rarely saw her in such an outfit. She usually chose something simpler for everyday work. A second car pulled up to the porch of the house, a silver sedan. A man in a business jacket got out. Mark didn't know him, apparently, the same client. No suspicious gestures. Emily shook the man's hand professionally. They exchanged a few words, then disappeared inside the house. Mark exhaled, both with relief and a new wave of doubt. On the one hand, she really was at work, as she had said. On the other, could he be sure that after this show she wouldn't go somewhere else? He sat in the car for about 40 minutes until Emily and her client came out. They went down to their cars. Parting ways, the man looked pleased. Surely the deal was going to be a success. Emily was smiling, but as soon as the client got into the car and drove away, her face seemed to lose its enthusiasm. She stood for a few seconds, watching him go, then took a deep breath and headed to her car too. Mark kept quiet. He expected that his wife would now perhaps go to the next meeting place or to the office. But instead, something strange happened. Emily took out her phone, typed a message, and, judging by her concentrated face, waited for a response. A minute later, her phone blinked. Emily read the response and immediately turned around, getting into the car. Mark immediately became wary. She had obviously changed her plans, judging by her agility. And for some reason, she didn't go towards the office, but on the contrary, she turned onto the highway that led beyond the city limits. He started the engine a few cars behind her, trying to keep his distance so as not to be noticed. Her head was working feverishly. Where was she going? Emily drove confidently, exceeding the speed limit in places, as if she was in a hurry. Several times Mark had to fall behind so as not to give himself away. They crossed the railroad tracks and entered a quieter area with the occasional industrial building and warehouse hangar. It was a sparsely populated place, especially on a weekday. Finally, the sign for the old Lakeview Inn Motel by the small lake came into view. Mark froze, recognizing it long ago. Before they were married, he and Emily had stayed there for weekends, boating. Now the motel looked shabby, but apparently still in business. The motel sign crackled with neon light. The few letters of the name were out of order. There were only a couple of cars in the parking lot. The porch of the main building was slanted, and a dim light above the entrance flickered next to the motel office. The place looked deserted, as if time had forgotten it. He watched Emily's car turn into the motel and pull into the parking lot behind the main building, where there was less visibility from the road. Mark himself drove a little further and pulled to the side of the road, hiding behind a tan mail van. Her heart pounded loudly in her ears. Emily got out of the car and looked around, as if checking if anyone was watching her. Mark hid even deeper. A minute later, another car pulled up from the other side of the parking lot, dark blue, familiar. Mark felt his insides go cold. It was Brian's SUV. He couldn't be mistaken. The distinctive dent in the rear bumper, left over from the winter, caught his eye. Brian came out, and Mark saw him clearly. His friend didn't look around. He probably knew that the place was quiet. Emily quickly walked up to him. Because of the distance, Mark couldn't hear what they were saying, but he saw Brian gently touch Emily's shoulder with his hand, then run his palm down her cheek. His wife didn't pull away. On the contrary, she nodded and stepped closer. Another moment, and they embraced. Mark's vision went dark. He blinked, hoping he was imagining things, but no, Emily and Brian were standing, pressed against each other, and then Brian leaned down and kissed her. Time stood still as Mark watched his best friend kiss his wife in the deserted parking lot of a rundown motel. Everything inside him was screaming. He gripped the steering wheel with his fingers, feeling like the world had suddenly collapsed. He wanted to jump out of the car and run towards them with his fists. But his body wouldn't obey him. He seemed to have turned to stone, pressed into the seat. Meanwhile, Emily and Brian broke off their kiss and quickly headed towards one of the motel buildings, disappearing around the corner. Only then did Mark regain the ability to move. He opened the door and stepped out, unable to feel his feet. His heart was beating so hard that it seemed like it was about to burst. For a moment he thought about running after them, but he stopped. What would he do? Burst in and cause a scene? Fight with Brian? His mind was racing. The betrayal that had been revealed before his eyes stunned him, but part of him knew he needed proof. He needed clarity. With trembling hands, he took his phone out of his pocket. Coming closer to the motel, he raised the camera, mentally apologizing if someone else's car got into the frame. He clicked once. Twice he managed to capture how the door of one of the rooms closed behind them. The photo might show their figures at the entrance. Mark put the phone down, nausea rising in his throat. My own voice sounded in my head, as if from the outside. It's true, they are lovers. Images came to mind: Emily smiling at Brian over a friendly dinner, Brian giving him expensive whiskey for his birthday, her and him close, always within the bounds of what was acceptable. Had they really been, all this time? Mark closed his eyes, trying to drive away the image of the kiss that was etched into his memory. Anger and pain mixed together, sending shivers through his body. He needed to leave, or he would lose his temper. He hurried back to his car, trying not to even look in the direction of the motel. His hands were shaking as he inserted the key into the ignition. As he pulled back onto the road, he suddenly realized that his eyes were full of tears. But he had no right to cry now. There was a road ahead. He needed to get home safely. Home, what does it matter now? Flashed through my head. The home he considered the family's fortress instantly ceased to be so. Mark pushed away the approaching hysteria with an effort. Later. He would allow himself to think about all this later. But now just go. The car obediently sped along the highway, but everything inside Mark was broken. At one point, in a desperate impulse, he even wanted to sharply turn the steering wheel and steer the car into a roadside pole, just to end this unbearable pain at once. How easy it would be to end it all. But the next moment, it was as if he had been doused with cold water. He had no right to do this to his son, who knew nothing and was waiting for him in the safety of the school. Returning to the suburbs, he parked at a small park not far from his house. He couldn't stay alone within the walls of his own home. Now every corner there breathed her presence, their shared past. Instead, Mark went out and sat on a bench near a deserted playground. He didn't know how long he sat there, staring blankly at the swing, which was slowly rocked by the wind. The minutes flowed together. There was an emptiness in his head, through which new details slowly emerged now in a different light. That's why Emily was distracted and nervous. That's where that alien cologne came from. That's why she hadn't wanted intimacy in the last few weeks, citing fatigue. Each fact formed a single mosaic, the pattern of which inspired disgust and pain. Mark felt like a fool who had been deceived. His chest was burning with resentment. His best friend and the woman he loved, the two closest people, had betrayed him. Why? This silent scream echoed inside his skull. He tried to understand. How? How long did this go on? Who was to blame? But no matter how much you go through the details, you won't find the answer now. Mark suddenly remembered how several years ago, he and Emily stood at the altar in a small church outside Chicago. She, in a snow-white dress, with a happy smile, pronounced an oath of love and fidelity, promising to be by his side until the end of days. Then these words seemed sacred, unbreakable. He believed her, believed every look in her shining eyes, promising honesty and devotion. He himself then swore to protect her, never to hurt her. How everything turned upside down now. Why? He cried out mentally. Mark leaned his elbows on his knees and covered his face with his hands. He tried to figure out what to do next, but his thoughts were tearing his brain apart in a chaotic whirlwind. One question kept popping up. What next? It is no longer possible to live as before. That old world has collapsed and cannot be brought back. Mark remembered the photos on his phone. He took out his mobile and looked at them. The pictures were blurry, taken from afar, but when enlarged, he could make out figures. Here was Emily, recognizable by her gait, and across from her was a tall man he knew down to his last facial feature. For him, these pictures were enough. Proof that materialized his worst nightmare. Mark suddenly realized that the last thing he wanted to do now was go back to that house and wait for Emily to show up with a smile and a new lie. He had to do something. But what? Tell her everything right when we meet? Make a scene? Demand an explanation? Or maybe. Mark caught his breath. The thought of his son sobered him up again. Oliver. He shouldn't understand anything, shouldn't suffer because of adults' mistakes. How to protect it? The pain eased slightly as Mark switched to this thought. He had to act for his son. Taking a deep breath, Mark rose from the bench. The solution began to take shape. He won't make a scene in front of the boy. It takes time and space to sort things out. And first of all, I had to pull myself together and meet Oliver after school, pretending that everything was okay. Trembling, he walked slowly toward the car. Oliver first, then the truth, he thought to himself, trying to keep himself from despair. One thing he knew for sure, a storm was inevitable this evening. Mark could hardly wait for the evening to come. He picked up his son from school and, through the pain, pretended to be in his usual mood. Oliver was happily telling him about the new assignment, and Mark was listening with half an ear, nodding and smiling in the right places. Everything inside him was freezing at the thought of what would happen next, but for the sake of the child he held on. Emily came home, as if nothing had happened, around 6 o'clock. Hearing the sound of her car in the yard, Mark seemed to turn to stone. This was the moment when he would have to look her in the eye, knowing what he knew. "Daddy's here," she called from the doorway as she walked inside. Oliver rushed to his mother. "Mom, look, I got an A." Emily smiled and hugged her son. "Wow, well done. I'm so proud of you." Mark watched the scene from the living room, his heart sinking. Her smile was so genuine at the sight of her son. How could she lead a double life? Was it all a lie? "Mark, how are you?" Emily asked, helping her son take off his backpack. "Is your headache better? You look tired." He nodded silently, the words caught in his throat. "I'm going to start cooking dinner now," she continued, clearly trying to be cheerful. or have you already done something? No need, he said dully. I'm not hungry. Did Oliver eat at Grandma's? Mrs. Hopkins, the neighbor, the son corrected. She gave me a pie. I see, Mark ran his hand over his face. Oliver, come here. The boy, sensing the tension in his father's voice, obediently approached. You've already done your homework, right? Yeah, the son answered warily. Then maybe you should go to bed early tonight. You're tired after school, and I'd like you to get some rest before tomorrow. Mark knew he was talking nonsense, but he desperately needed to get his son out of the room. Oliver frowned. But it's still too early now. No objections, Mark said unexpectedly sharply. The boy fell silent in fear. I'll walk you out, Emily intervened quickly, casting a puzzled glance at her husband. A few minutes later, she returned downstairs alone. What happened? She asked quietly. You've been different all day. Mark stood in the middle of the living room, arms crossed over his chest. He didn't answer right away. His mind was racing with conversation starters, but none of them seemed right. Emily took a step towards him. Darling, you're scaring me. He looked up at her. How many times had he looked into those green eyes, searching for comfort, joy, love? Now he was searching for at least a shadow of remorse or a lie, but she only looked worried. This suddenly made him angry. How skillfully she wears a mask. She was just kissing her son, smiling, and now she was worried about his mood, like a model wife. The anger that flared up gave him determination. Where were you this afternoon? Mark asked directly, trying to keep his voice even. Emily blinked. What do you mean? At work. I had house showings, then a meeting at the office, you know. The meeting at the office, yes, he nodded, feeling his insides boil. And in between, any changes in plans, like a stop at the Lakeview Inn? Emily turned pale in an instant, as if all the blood had been sucked out of her at once. Her lips parted in surprise, and she recoiled. What? Mark took a step forward, not taking his hard gaze off her. I repeat, did you stop by the old motel by the lake today? She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Just an exhalation. Mark understood everything from her eyes. He didn't even need words. Then yes, he hissed. Emily leaned her back against the wall, covering her mouth with a trembling hand. Mark, don't you dare deny it, he raised his voice, and Emily flinched. I saw it all with my own eyes. It's not what you think, she croaked. Mark smiled bitterly. Really? So you didn't kiss Brian there? At the mention of her friend's name, Emily's eyes widened even more. She realized that it was all over. There was no point in lying. Mark, I'm sorry. Sorry. He started to shout, then caught himself and lowered his voice, remembering his son upstairs. Are you sorry? You cheated on me with my best friend, and you have the nerve to say that you're sorry. Tears gushed from her eyes. Please let me explain. Explain? He couldn't stop. The words lashed out like a whip. How long has this been going on? Weeks? Months? She covered her face with her hands. 2 months. Mark clenched his fists to keep from breaking anything. 2 months of lies, betrayal right under his nose. How could you? His voice trembled, and he stopped short, feeling tears suddenly welling up. But he wouldn't allow himself to cry in front of her. I didn't mean to hurt you, Emily moaned through her fingers. I didn't mean. It all got out of control. You didn't think. Mark glanced up, afraid that the child would hear the screams, and hissed more quietly. You met behind my back for 2 months, and you didn't think that it would hurt me? How noble. Emily dropped her hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. Forgive me. Forgive me. There was such genuine pain in her eyes that Mark's heart sank. Part of him wanted to give in, to comfort her as usual. But he pushed aside this weakness. Why? Was all he could squeeze out. Why are you doing this to me? Emily shook her head, looking down. I don't know myself. It just happened. Things have been difficult between us lately. You're always at work, I felt like. In need of a comforter. Mark finished sarcastically. And you found it in my childhood friend. Brilliant. She closed her eyes, continuing to cry silently. For a moment, a heavy silence hung in the living room, broken only by their intermittent breathing. Mark sank into his chair, suddenly feeling empty. All the rage was gone, leaving only a bottomless weariness. "Do you love him?" he asked hoarsely after a long pause. Emily froze, looking at his face. She took a deep breath. "I got confused, I thought, but right now, do you love him?" Mark repeated, gathering the last of his courage. He needed the truth, no matter how painful it was. I don't know," she whispered at last. "I thought so, but I love you too, in a different way." Mark closed his eyes, holding back a groan. Such words only drove the knife deeper. "So you have both him and me? Great," he chuckled with bitter anger. Duplicity at the highest level. "I'm sorry," she whispered again. "Stop repeating that." Mark exploded, jumping up. "Do you think 1,000 apologies will be enough to fix everything?" Emily stepped back, clutching her hands to her chest. "I understand your anger." "You don't understand anything." He shook his head, feeling himself boiling again. "You destroyed everything, Emily. Our family, trust." "Don't say that," she sobbed. "We still have a chance to fix everything, for Oliver's sake." Mark suddenly laughed a short, nervous laugh. "Fix it? How? Pretend like nothing happened? Just forget that you betrayed me." Emily shook her head. "No, I'm ready to do anything for you to forgive me. I'll break up with him, honestly. It was a mistake." Watching her cry and beg, Mark felt a conflict seething inside. Part of him still loved this woman, the mother of his child, his life partner for so many years. This part wanted to believe her, wanted to seize the chance. But the other part, insulted, trampled, could not so easily forget the picture they had seen, their embrace and kiss. "I don't know," he grabbed his head. "How can I trust you now?" "Please." She stepped closer, trying to take his hands. "I understand everything. But I love you, really." It was a delusion, an infatuation. Mark pulled his hands away. "A delusion. You've done this consciously 100 times in 2 months. Don't you dare downplay it." Emily's face contorted in pain. Okay, she seemed to give in, closing her eyes. "It's my fault. There are no excuses for me." Mark breathed heavily as he looked at her. "Mark," she said quietly after a pause, "what should we do now?" He closed his eyes. His son's smile appeared in his mind's eye. For his sake, it was probably worth trying to remain calm, at least not to act rashly. "For starters," he said with difficulty, "I don't want you to talk to Brian at all, ever." "Of course," she nodded quickly. "Of course, I was going to stop everything myself." "Stop?" Mark snorted. "This is the second time you've said this, so you weren't going to before." "I was afraid, I didn't know how," she muttered. "Damn it, Emily," he said, his voice rising again. "It's Brian. Did you even think what would happen if I found out? You both thought I was a complete idiot, didn't you?" She shook her head, wiping away tears. "No, we just didn't think." "Yeah," Mark smiled darkly. "We didn't think so." Classic. He walked around the room, trying to calm his racing heart. Emily stood leaning against the wall, silent, as if she was afraid to irritate him with another word. And yet it wasn't enough for him. These pathetic apologies weren't enough. The pain demanded an outlet. He wanted to hit, scream, cry, everything at once. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a sharp sound with vibration. Emily's phone vibrated in her pocket. They both jumped. Emily slowly pulled out her smartphone. In the silence that followed, you could clearly hear her sharply inhale as she saw the screen. Mark stepped closer and snatched the phone from her before she could hide it. "Mark, don't," she screamed, trying to get it back. But he could already see the name of the incoming call flashing. Brian. Blood filled his eyes. "He's calling," Mark barked. "At this very minute." Emily burst into tears. "I didn't ask. I don't know how he found out." Mark accepted the call and brought the phone to his ear, squeezing the device as if he wanted to crush it. "You bastard." He growled into the receiver, but the other end had already hung up. Brian apparently heard Mark's voice and realized what had happened. The phone vibrated again. Brian was calling back. Mark threw the phone on the couch, not wanting to listen to either him or her anymore. "So he was worried about how you got there, or what?" Mark muttered through his teeth. "I don't know." Emily covered her face with her hands, sinking into a chair. He stood there, seething with rage. It seemed that in another moment his mind would go clouded. "There," Mark said quietly, amazed at how calm it sounded. "What?" Emily looked up at him with tear-stained eyes. "Get out of my house," he repeated, louder this time. "I can't look at you right now." Emily shook her head. "Mark, no. Please. This is my home, too. Our home." "Not now," he snapped harshly. "Otherwise I—" He stopped short, not finishing his sentence. Otherwise he would go mad, hit her, or worse, he didn't say that, but the air was already ringing with the threat of unbridled rage. Emily stood up slowly. "Where? Where will I spend the night?" "Go to him," Mark blurted out. "You were going there, weren't you?" "No," she sobbed. "I don't want to go to him." "Then get in the car and go wherever you want." Her shoulders slumped. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded. "Okay, I'll leave, but tomorrow we have to talk." He didn't answer, looking away. Emily slowly walked up to the coat rack, threw her coat over her house jacket, and picked up her bag with trembling hands. "Please keep an eye on Oliver." "Don't even dare tell me that," Mark snapped. "I'll take care of my son myself." She lowered her head. "I'll call tomorrow. I beg you, don't do anything rash." Mark smiled bitterly. "I already did it when I got married, apparently." Emily flinched as if he had hit her. She began, but he stepped toward the door and opened it wide. "That's it. Go away." Tears streamed down her face as she stepped through the door. Mark slammed the door without even looking after her. Left alone, he punched the wall in helpless rage. The pain barely reached his consciousness. The other, mental pain, was too strong. Is this the end? He banished her. True, only for a night, until he sorts himself out, but his chest was constricted with contradictions. It hurt. He hated her at that moment, and at the same time he hated himself for these feelings. He walked around the empty house, not knowing what to do with himself. He went into the living room. His gaze fell on a family photo. He, Emily, and little Oliver on the beach, a couple of years ago, all so happy. Mark grabbed the frame, wanting to throw it against the wall, but stopped himself in time. His hands were shaking. Instead, he carefully put the photo back and sank heavily onto the sofa, covering his face. "What now?" Her words rang in my ears like an annoying ringing. "For Oliver's sake. We have a chance to fix everything." And also the name of a friend pounding in my temples. "Brian, Brian, Brian." Mark's head snapped up. His rage was demanding an outlet. He couldn't just sit back. Some part of his mind knew he was incapable of making balanced decisions right now. But having a goal in front of him, at least to take revenge on Brian, seemed like a way out. He's probably sitting in his house right now, worrying about her. Maybe he's already texting her, calling her. Mark knew he wouldn't rest until he looked his former friend in the eyes. He stood up abruptly. Emily's phone was lying on the couch. She had forgotten it in her confusion. Mark grabbed it and put it in his pocket. He would give it back when the opportunity arose. A minute later, he was already crossing the street, heading towards the house opposite, where a light was burning in the living room window. Brian paced nervously around the living room, unable to find a place for himself. His hands were shaking, his split lip was sore. He hadn't yet managed to treat the wound from the morning fight with Mark. And how could iodine help here if his conscience hurt much more? The house was plunged into silence. Outside the window, the deserted streets were black. The rare car drove past. Brian went to the window, looked out through the curtain. The light was on in Mark's windows. What was going on there now? Was Emily with him? Brian ran his fingers through his hair nervously. Everything had collapsed in an instant. Mark knew. Now he knew everything, or at least he guessed enough. When Brian called Emily's phone and heard his friend's furious voice on the other end of the line, his blood ran cold. He hung up, unsure of what to say. He tried calling Emily right away, but she didn't answer. "Damn," he whispered, feverishly pacing the room. What to do now? Run. But where in the middle of the night? And he didn't want to be a coward. "I'll explain everything." He wanted to write to Mark, but stopped himself. What explanations now? The betrayal is too great. Brian found himself listening to the sounds outside. He thought he would hear a knock on the door any minute now, or even a police siren if Mark decided to file a report of assault. Emily, where is she now? What happened to her? Maybe Mark did something to her? No, Mark is not like that. But a person is not himself when he is angry. Brian remembered his friend's eyes a few hours ago, full of pain and rage. He wanted to run to the house across the street to make sure Emily was okay, but he knew that showing up in front of Mark now was the worst idea of all. He sank down on the sofa and covered his face with his hands. How did he get to this point? Lost his best friend, broke up someone else's family. And for what? For love, which now seemed to have the most bitter end. If he could turn back time, he would have pulled himself back that first night he kissed Emily. He would have stopped. But the past couldn't be changed. Brian jumped when he heard a sudden loud sound. Someone pressed the doorbell hard. My heart sank into my heels. "Mark," flashed through my head. Of course, he won't wait until the morning. Brian stood up on wobbly legs. Another moment of hesitation, and he stepped towards the door, ready to meet his friend's wrath face to face. Mark climbed heavily up the steps of Brian's house, his eyes clouded with rage and his temples pounding. He pressed the doorbell hard. The door opened almost immediately, as if a friend was standing on the other side and waiting. Brian was pale. Seeing Mark's distorted face, he raised his palms, trying to stop a possible attack with a gesture. "Mark, calm down." The sight of him alone was enough to make Mark lose his nerve. He lunged forward and grabbed Brian by the collar of his shirt. "Calm down. You slept with my wife, you monster," he hissed right in the face of his former friend. Brian grabbed his wrists with his hands. "I'll explain everything. Let us talk." "Explain? What is there to explain?" Mark shook him, hitting him against the door frame. "You betrayed me. I trusted you like a brother. Let you into the house. To the family." Brian exhaled with difficulty. "I know. I can't be forgiven. I'm sorry, my friend." "Don't you dare call me that," Mark barked, leaning his weight on him. He was stronger, and Brian felt himself sag under the pressure. "You're not my friend anymore." Tears glistened in Brian's eyes. "I understand. I understand everything. We didn't want it to turn out this way." "You didn't want to." Mark threw him away with force. Brian flew into the depths of the hallway, almost tripping. "Lying bitch." Mark followed, slamming the door behind him. "Come on, tell me," he shouted, getting heated. "How long have you had your eye on her? You were pretending to be a family friend, Uncle Brian, for fuck's sake." Brian raised his head, trying to maintain his composure. "It just happened, Mark. You have to understand. There were feelings between Amy and me. We didn't mean to hurt you." Feelings arise. Mark literally shook with rage how Brian managed to make him look guilty. "Oh, you." He rushed at Brian, pressing him against the wall. Brian didn't even resist, only covered his head with his hands, expecting a blow. "Hit me if you want," Brian croaked. "I deserve it." Mark swung. At the last moment, he stopped his fist, hitting the wall nearby. The drywall cracked from the impact. "Your mother, Brian." He took a step back, his chest burning. "How could you? I have no words." Brian lowered his hands carefully. "I understand that there will be no forgiveness. But Mark, believe me, I really love Emily." "Shut up," Mark roared, rushing forward again. "Don't you dare say her name." He punched Brian in the jaw. He groaned and staggered. "You stole her from me. You stole my life." Mark struck again, this time across the cheekbone. Brian fell to his knees. Blood was running down his friend's lip, but he did not raise his hands against Mark. Fight, coward, Mark breathed, grabbing him by the collar and raising him to his feet again. Come on, did you like groping someone else's wife? Are you a man or not? He pushed Brian away, and Brian crashed into a nightstand against the wall, and a vase of flowers fell on it with a crash, shattering into pieces. Next to the vase, which hit the floor, a photo frame fell with a crash. Mark caught a glimpse of himself, smiling, with his arm around Emily and Brian's shoulders at the picnic last year. The glass shattered, cutting the picture into a crooked crack. It was as if the picture symbolized what had happened, and Mark roared with rage even louder. Brian leaned his hand against the wall, trying to hold himself up. "Mark, please," he croaked. "I understand your pain, but Amy—" "What? What about Amy?" Mark asked dangerously quietly, taking a step. "She wasn't happy with you," Brian blurted out, breathing heavily, still making excuses. "You never noticed how much pain she was in, how lonely she felt. I was just trying to give her what you weren't giving her, a little warmth and understanding." Mark was stunned for a moment by these words. Then he growled and literally pounced on Brian, driving his fists into his chest. "You bastard! Are you still making me feel guilty?" They grappled. This time Brian, apparently realizing that things could end much worse, tried to fight back. He hit Mark with his elbow, trying to fight back. The fight moved into the living room. The men kept bumping into furniture, and one of the chairs crashed down with a crash, hit by their bodies. Brian, having received another crushing blow, responded. His fist hit Mark in the cheekbone, cutting his lip. The pain only inflamed Mark. He lunged at Brian, knocking him to the floor. They rolled, exchanging a few more blows. "Stop it!" A cry suddenly rang out. Emily stood in the doorway of the living room, her eyes wide with terror, her face wet with tears. She must have been watching them all this time. Perhaps she had come back in fear of something like this. "Stop!" she screamed, rushing towards the fighters. "Please!" Brian and Mark paused for a second, catching their breath. They both looked terrible. Brian's shirt was torn. There were bruises on his face. Mark had a split lip. His palm was covered in blood. He didn't even know if it was his own or someone else's. Emily ran up and stood between them, pressing her hands against Mark's chest. "Mark, stop. I beg you." He took a step back, breathing heavily. Brian stood up too, holding his shoulder. "Amy," he began. "Shut up." She turned to him with sudden fury. "Just shut up, Brian." He opened his mouth, but said nothing, stepping back. Emily took a deep breath and turned back to her husband. "Go home, please. I asked you. Don't make things worse." Her trembling voice and desperate look sobered Mark up a little. He ran his tongue over his split lip, tasting the iron-like taste of blood, and spat on the floor. "Make it worse?" he asked hoarsely. "What more could you want?" "It's my fault," she whispered. "Don't make it worse, Oliver." At the mention of his son, Mark closed his eyes painfully. "Yes, our son," he muttered, "who will now grow up in a falling-apart family because of you too." Emily burst into tears, shaking her head. "Don't talk like that." "How?" Mark flared up again. "Does the truth hurt? Do you think it's that simple?" He looked at them both with a fiery gaze. Brian stood a few paces away, his head down. Emily was between them, turning first to one, then to the other, as if not knowing whom to hold back. "I loved you both." Mark's voice trembled. "With boundless trust. And you." "I'm sorry," Emily said again, sobbing. Mark smiled bitterly. These empty words again. Brian took a timid step forward. "Mark, if you want, hit her some more. Just don't yell at her." "Oh, you," Mark jerked again, but Emily pressed both hands against his chest, preventing him from jerking away. "No, stop it," she screamed, looking into his face through her tears. "Mark, please." "Move away, Emily," he said quietly, looking over her head at Brian. "Or do you still have any warmth for that bastard?" She shook her head. "What does it have to do with it? I don't want you to hurt each other." "It's too late," Mark said gloomily. "Please, for my son's sake, for everything." She whispered haltingly, still pressing her palms against him. Mark glanced at her hands on his chest. The tip of her finger was touching the open collar of his shirt. This touch suddenly sobered him up completely. He realized that he had almost done something irreparable. What was the point of fighting any longer? What had happened could not be changed, and he was only putting himself on the edge that was better not to cross. The rage was replaced by a sudden feeling of emptiness. Mark took a step back. "Okay," he said dully. "That's it. I've had enough." Emily breathed a sigh of relief. "Thank you." She turned to Brian. "And you better go. Just leave." "Where to?" he responded bitterly. "This is my home." "Then I'll go," she said, grabbing her purse, which she had apparently left by the door when she ran after him. Mark sank heavily into the remaining chair, trying to catch his breath. His hands were shaking from the strain. He felt blood dripping from his cut lip onto his chin. Emily walked up to him, raising her hand in concern. "You're wounded." He turned away. "Don't touch me." She sobbed and stepped back. Brian remained silent, leaning against the wall. There was an awkward silence. Finally, Emily said quietly, "Mark, let's go home. Please." He didn't have time to answer. There was a new sound. A cell phone rang. But not hers or Brian's. Mark's own phone, suddenly reminding him of itself from his pocket. Mark mechanically pulled it out and looked at the screen, an unknown number. "It must have been me," Emily said hesitantly, remembering that she had left her phone number. "I called through the Bryans." Mark hesitated, but still answered. "Hello, Dad?" Oliver's frightened voice rang out. "It's me. Uncle Brian had a number in his book." "Where are you?" Mark went cold. "Son." He left the boy alone in the house. "Olia, are you home? Is everything okay?" he asked quickly, feeling all his emotions switch to worrying about the child. "I woke up. You're not here. Mom's not here." The boy's voice trembled. "I'm scared." Mark squeezed the phone. "Sorry, baby. I'll be right there. Are you in your room?" "I came down." "You are nowhere." "Oliver, it's okay. I'm here," Mark said quickly, waving his hand at Emily. "Mom's here, too. We'll be there in a minute, okay?" Cold. "Just don't leave the house, do you hear? Stay inside. We're on our way." "Fine." Mark passed out, standing up. His heart was pounding this time from fear for his son and shame. How could he lose his head and abandon the boy? Emily also listened in horror, judging by the widened eyes. She realized that the child was alone. "Oh God," she whispered. "Mark, hurry up." He nodded, giving Brian a deadly look. "Idiot. I almost abandoned my son because of you." Brian turned pale and turned away, realizing that there was no point in arguing. Mark rushed to the exit, and Emily followed. One thought was beating in his head. If only Oliver wouldn't be scared to death. They ran out into the night. Mark immediately ran across the road to his house. "Oli," he called loudly, throwing open the front door. The son ran out of the living room in his pajamas, pale and frightened. "Dad." Mark picked him up, hugging him tightly. "I'm here. Everything is fine. Sorry for scaring you." Oliver trembled, clinging to his father. Emily also ran up and hugged them both. "Darling, forgive me. We stepped away for a while." The boy clung to her, crying. "I thought that you left me." "Never, do you hear?" Mark whispered, stroking his son's back. "Forgive us, please." He felt a lump of guilt and pain rising in his throat. Why was the child suffering? Oliver looked from his father to his mother, his eyes filled with incomprehension and fear. "Why are you?" he began, but Mark shook his head. "It's okay, Olia. Sometimes adults need to talk. Mom and I just—" He couldn't finish, but Emily picked up. "We just had a little fight. But that's it. Don't cry." She kissed her son on his cheeks, wet with tears. "Have you made up?" he sobbed. Mark met Emily's gaze. Her eyes begged him for confirmation. "Yes," he lied quietly, stroking the boy's head. "Everything is fine now. We're close." Oliver nodded and hugged them both tightly. Mark and Emily knelt down and hugged their son from either side, exchanging a pained look over his shoulders. The night passed restlessly and without sleep. After Oliver had calmed down and fallen asleep again, Mark and Emily were left alone in the kitchen. The house was tensely silent, broken only by the ticking of the clock. They sat across from each other at the table, avoiding direct eye contact. Finally, Mark spoke in a hoarse, quiet voice. "Forgive me for leaving him alone, and for almost." He trailed off, but Emily understood. "It's my fault, too," she whispered. "I shouldn't have run after you, leaving him, but I was afraid you'd kill each other." Mark pinched the bridge of his nose with his fingers, fighting the migraine pounding in his temples. "You're probably right. Just a little more, and I don't know how it would have ended," he quietly admitted. Emily let out a choked sob, but quickly pulled herself together. "Thanks for stopping." Mark was silent, staring at the pattern on the tablecloth. He couldn't bear to be near her, and at the same time he didn't want to leave. There was too much to figure out. "Tell me," he finally said, barely audible. How did it all start?" Emily looked up at him with wide eyes. "Do you want details? I thought you wouldn't want to know." "I don't want to," he snapped harshly. Then, after a pause, he squeezed out, "But I need to. Otherwise, I'll go crazy, running through my guesses." Emily nodded, wiping her reddened eyes with the back of her hand. She was silent for a moment, gathering her thoughts. Mark waited, holding his breath, even though part of his heart screamed at him not to listen to this. "Remember 3 months ago, you went to a conference in Denver for the weekend?" she began quietly. Mark nodded silently. Of course he remembered. How could it be otherwise? That evening, Emily spoke, looking away, as if she was afraid to meet his gaze. "The power went out. There was a big storm, a thunderstorm. Do you remember how the storm even knocked down a tree at the neighbors?" His face darkened as he remembered. Yes, a major storm had hit the area. Oliver was sleeping, but I was scared. Everything went dark. The fuses blew. I don't know much about electricity. I called Brian. He lived closest and knows a lot about it. He came right away, fixed the panel. I was nervous then. We drank a cup of tea, waiting out the storm. And she trembled, covering her mouth with her hand. Mark forced himself to say, "Continue." "Somehow, we got to talking. I was complaining about the weather. He was joking. Then it started pouring rain. Brian got wet on the way. I gave him a towel, persuaded him to wait out the bad weather in the living room." Emily spoke more and more quietly, and at some point he looked at me differently and kissed me. She squeezed out the last words barely audibly. Mark closed his eyes, holding back a shudder. Here it was, the first betrayal. "I pushed him away then," Emily said quickly. "I told him it was wrong. He apologized and walked out into the rain. I thought that was the end of it." "But no," Mark said hoarsely, feeling his heart being crushed with pain. Emily shook her head. "Then everything was tense for a while. We didn't talk about it, pretended that nothing had happened. But it was as if a spark had already run between us. I was struggling with myself, and I think he was too. But a few weeks later, it all happened again." She sighed convulsively. "It happened after you went fishing with him. Remember, you came back late then. You both had a drink, I think." Mark remembered. About 2 months ago, he and Brian had gone to the lake for a day. Back then, his friend had asked him a lot about his family life, about whether he and Emily were happy. Now he understood why. That night he came to see me, supposedly to ask how our trip was. I shouldn't have let him in, but... Emily closed her eyes. "I was mad at you." Mark raised his head in surprise. "On me? For what?" "You forgot then," she said barely audibly. "You forgot to call us before bed, like you promised Oliver. He was upset then, and I was too." Mark fell silent. Indeed, such a case had happened. The phone had died, and he decided that it was nothing serious. It turns out that this little thing had hurt her. Anyway, he came. We drank some wine, and he confessed that he thought about me all the time, that he had fallen in love. I should have stopped him, thrown him out, but maybe something broke inside me. I was hurt and lonely, and I kissed him myself. Silence hung over the table. Mark froze, trying to comprehend what he had heard. Then Emily didn't finish, but Mark understood. He clenched his fists on his knees, but his voice remained icy. So we crossed the border. She nodded, wiping away her tears. Yes. And then, we couldn't go back. It was wrong, terrible, but we were like madmen. Every time we swore it wouldn't happen again, and a few days later again. Only a few times, honestly. Enough, Mark cut her off, raising his palm. He couldn't bear to hear these details any longer. Emily fell silent, covering her face with trembling hands. They sat in silence for a long time. Finally, Mark broke the silence. "Thank you for telling the truth." She sobbed. "You hate me now. I understand." Mark didn't answer. He felt so tired that he didn't even have the strength to hate, only devastation. "What next?" Emily asked quietly. He shook his head. "I don't know. I definitely can't decide today." Emily nodded. They decided to postpone the conversation until the morning, so as not to say anything too hastily. He made himself a bed on the sofa in the living room. Emily went into the bedroom. Lying in the dark, Mark heard her quietly crying behind the closed door. He felt empty. No tears came, only a silent cold inside. He remembered how he had woken up next to her yesterday morning, knowing nothing, and how everything was different now. It seemed like a whole lifetime had passed. Towards morning, he nevertheless fell into a restless sleep, full of nightmares. He dreamed of their bedroom, covered in blood, and Emily on the bed, stretching out her bloody hands to him and whispering, "I'm sorry." He woke up in a sweat and could not close his eyes again. A damp November chill hung in the air. There were hardly any leaves left on the trees' black branches stretched towards the low gray sky. Mark stood at the fence of a small city park, his hands in his jacket pockets, watching the children's playground. Oliver was riding the carousel, and Emily was at his side, holding him from falling, her laughter ringing thinly in the still, cold air as her son, arms outstretched, asked her to spin him even faster. Mark couldn't help but smile at the corners of his lips as he saw the boy's shining face. Moments like these were worth enduring any pain for. During the 3 months of living apart, he and his wife had established an unspoken truce for the sake of their son. Every weekend, Emily came from Milwaukee to visit Oliver. Mark did not interfere. He saw how the boy missed his mother. He himself tried to be away during these hours so as not to interfere with their communication. Today, Oliver had persuaded them both to go to the park together, to ride the swings and the carousel. Mark hadn't refused, although he had hardly said a word all day. He could feel Emily trying to act as natural as possible, but the tension between them was still palpable. Now, watching from the side as she laughed with her son, Mark tried to sort out his feelings. The pain of betrayal had dulled, but it hadn't gone away. It had settled deep inside, sometimes giving way to a dull melancholy. Emily noticed his gaze and waved her hand. "Mark, come to us. Oli wants you to spin him." He hesitated for a moment, then walked towards them. The boy had already run off the carousel and was running up to his father. "Dad, come on. Mom's arms are already tired." "Come on, champ," Mark smiled, picking his son up under the arms and sitting him back on the round platform. He began to spin the carousel, and Emily took a few steps back, admiring them. Mark tried not to meet her eyes. He talked to his son, asked questions, laughed, and felt Emily's gaze on him. At some point, Oliver waved his hands. "Enough, enough. My head is spinning." Mark held the spinning circle and helped his son get off. "Well, how is it?" "Cool," Oliver beamed. "Mom, Dad is great." "I know," Emily answered quietly, looking at Mark. For a second, their eyes met. There were so many mixed feelings in her eyes, the joy of playing with the child, and at the same time, an inescapable sadness. Mark looked away first. "It's time to go home," he said. "It's getting cold already." Oliver pouted. "Just a little bit more." "Let's do it this way," Emily chimed in. "We'll go home, grab some cocoa and marshmallows on the way, and drink it at home, the three of us. Just like old times, huh? The boy beamed. Exactly. Dad, can I? Mark's heart sank. Like the old days, alas, they could never return. But he couldn't refuse his son. Of course, he answered quietly. Oliver ran to the car ahead of his parents. Mark and Emily followed close behind. Thank you, she said just as quietly, not looking at him, but he understood that she agreed to spend time together for the sake of her son. He nodded, shoving his hands deeper into his pockets. At home, the three of them sat around the kitchen table with mugs of hot cocoa. Oliver chattered away, telling his mother about school news, showing her the new scrape on his knee he'd gotten in gym class. Mark barely participated, only occasionally getting in a word, but he watched Emily's face light up with happiness at spending these simple moments with her son. As the mugs emptied and the evening drew to a close, Oliver began to nod off right at the table. I think it's time for someone to go to bed, Emily said softly, brushing a strand of hair from her son's forehead. Aha, I don't want the day to end. The boy muttered, straightening up half asleep. Mom, are you leaving tomorrow? Emily smiled sadly. Yes, honey, but you'll see me very soon. He nodded sadly, closing his eyes. Come on, I'll carry you, hero, Mark said quietly, lifting his son into his arms. Oliver barely resisted. He was too languid from the warmth and satiety. Emily followed them up to the second floor. Mark laid the boy down and covered him with a blanket. Good night, Mom. Good night, Dad, Oliver whispered through his sleep. Sleep, darling, Emily whispered, kissing his cheek. Mark leaned over too, gently touching his lips to his son's forehead. They walked out together, closing the door to the nursery behind them. Downstairs, at the entrance, Emily put on her coat. The moment had arrived that Mark had always both waited for and dreaded during her visits, the moment of farewell. Thank you for this day, she said sincerely, tying the belt of her coat. It means a lot to Oliver. Everything for him, Mark nodded. Emily looked away, then said quietly, maybe, one day, and for the three of us again. No need, he asked, his voice breaking. She fell silent, biting her lip and blinking rapidly. He could see that she was holding back tears. Mark picked up her bag from the closet and held it out. Their fingers brushed briefly as she took the pen. I will come next week too, she said, trying to speak normally. I know. If you need anything. We can handle it, he said, not rudely, but firmly. Emily nodded. She lingered, standing on the threshold. It seemed she wanted to say something else, but she couldn't bring herself to. Take care of yourself, was all she finally said. You too. They looked at each other for another second. Then Emily turned and walked toward the car. Mark closed the door and leaned his back against it. His chest ached. No matter how hard he tried to appear calm, each of her goodbyes tore his soul apart anew. He heard the engine start, the wheels moving along the wet asphalt of the street. She was gone. Mark went upstairs and looked into his son's room. Oliver was sleeping, snoring peacefully in the arms of a teddy bear. So innocent, so pure. His little world was also shaken, but he trustingly waited for his mom and dad to fix everything. Mark sat down on the edge of the bed, careful not to wake his son. He ran his hand through his soft blonde hair. I'm sorry, baby, he whispered. We're trying really hard. The room filled with soft moonlight from the window. Mark felt his eyes fill with moisture. He didn't know what awaited their family next. Maybe the wound would heal someday and he would be able to forgive. Or maybe not. One thing he knew for sure. For this little sleeping boy, he would do everything he could. Even if their family would never be the same again, the love for their son would forever connect the three of them, albeit with a very fragile, broken thread. He wiped away the tears that had appeared and, leaning down, quietly kissed his son on the top of his head. His gaze slid to the bedside table, where there was a framed family photograph, the one from the beach where they had been so happy. Mark took the frame. A ray of moonlight slid playfully across the glass, catching their smiling faces from bygone times. Mark closed his eyes for a moment, and his memories took him back 7 years to the delivery room, where Emily, exhausted but happy, held out tiny, newborn Oliver to him. Mark had cried with happiness, kissing his wife's exhausted but smiling face. He remembered how he and Emily had looked into each other's eyes over their quietly snoring son, and felt that they were now inextricably linked. They were family. He looked at the photo for a long time, then put it back on the shelf. Maybe one day he would want to put it back in a prominent place, but for now it was too painful. Mark stood up, looked once more at his son's peaceful sleep, and firmly decided for himself. Whoever he and Emily would become to each other now, he had to become a support for their child. It would be difficult from now on, but he would endure. As he left the room, Mark closed the door and glanced at the photograph that now stared back at him from its shelf. He spoke quietly into the void. Goodbye, old life. End. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.